Good morning, everyone. It's great to be here. It's always hard to follow a fun act where you're doing improv and mostly comedy stuff, and then go to the wonky Harvard professor who's going to talk to you about cybersecurity and foreign policy frameworks. But like you heard, I'm not a real academic. I am a teacher, but I spent the last 8 years in the Obama administration. I was the DoD cyber czar, which sounds sexy until you remember that almost all czars are eventually assassinated. So keep that in mind. But I am a teacher, and so what I'd like today is for you to learn 3 things. The first is I want you to understand a little bit more about the nation-state threat to digital democracies. Second, I want you to understand how vulnerable we and other democracies are in total. And then third, a little bit about some of the things that both the country, other democracies, and the private sector, you all, can do to mitigate some of that threat. And I wanted to give a little advance warning too. I teach via the Socratic method, which means that I call on people in the audience. I know y'all got your reading assignment last night and you studied up. I didn't see anyone at the bar because they heard Rosenbach was going to cold call. I generally start by cold calling in the furthest corners of the room because those are the people usually who either stayed out too late, are slackers, or are trying to hide from the professor. So just beware, okay? With that, we'll get going. So I'd like to start with just talking about digital democracy and what that is. So, like I said, I'm going to go over here, far left corner. Sir, that's you. This is not to embarrass anyone, but just make sure you're all awake. Also, I'll just say explicitly, I always call on people who are looking at their laptop or their phone. So, again, good learning lesson. What's good about tech for democracy?
Access to information.
Access to information, exactly. Okay, that's good. Here, we'll get this next guy right here. This, by the way, is a perfect victim. This is the CEO of 2U. You probably heard him this morning. And he's also one of the guys that is the platform for an online class that I do that's more corporate about managing cyber risk anyway. So this is a good guy to ask you.
And by the way, is available in the gift lounge.
Yeah, it's me. They're giving away a class
We're gifting
of mine,
you, Eric.
which is very funny for me to see. But yes, sir, this part was not planned, by the way. Go ahead.
What was the question?
Remember, what is good about tech for a democracy?
Well, you eliminate the background education by giving people access.
Okay, it's an equalizer, right? That's good for a democracy. There's something that makes it more egalitarian, that people can rise up without the normal kind of like structures of a society. That's good. Okay, now we're going to go back over here. Sir, I'm sure you were thinking about it. My runners also, their step count is going to be pretty strong today. Okay, I'll go to you, sir, right here. What's one of the other great things about tech and a democracy?
It allows anyone to voice their opinion.
Can you say it again? A little
It
louder.
allows everyone to voice their opinion.
Yeah, exactly. So you can understand what people think. It gives more access to information. There's more transparency. So as you all know, in this crowd, there are a lot of great things about tech that have helped democracy and helped democracy thrive. The part that I'm concerned about, that I think maybe Silicon Valley and the tech sector in particular doesn't internalize enough, is that tech also makes democracies much more vulnerable. Right? The attack surface is huge. If 80% of all the data in the world was created over the last 2 years, that means that's a high-profile target for a lot of bad guys. It's been interesting to me to be here. I go in and out of Silicon Valley pretty often, but the number of times I heard CEOs actually talk about cybersecurity or the security of the data that they're collecting was very infrequent. That's disappointing to me. So another reason why you bring in a Harvard professor who used to be in charge of cyber at the Department of Defense to talk about this. So with that in mind, let's start to talk about some bad guys. You know, for the last 7.5 years, almost every morning I would go to the Pentagon about 5 a.m. I'd read my intel reports for cyber or otherwise, and there's a lot of bad stuff going on in the world. I won't talk about all of it, but I will say this. Most often, the country that worried me the most was North Korea, because they're so unpredictable, and a couple other things that we're going to talk about. So what I wanted to do for the core of this presentation is have you recognize digital democracy is important, but create a little mini case study, just like I do in class, and then test you all on what we're going to do. All right? Here's the case study. All right. So you need you all to read this, since you didn't do your reading last night. This is a fictional intelligence assessment that just came out. You need to pretend you're staffing the president or the Secretary of Defense or the Secretary of State or the commander of Cyber Command, and you're reading this assessment. This is based almost entirely on an assessment that was declassified in January of 2017 based on what the Russians did to the US election system. I substituted it with North Korea just so that we can have something a little bit different. You see a couple important things here. First of all, you almost never see a high confidence assessment from the intelligence community. That almost never happens. Otherwise, word for word. Okay, so let's see. Who's my next victim? We'll go right here. Yes, ma'am. This looks like a real live student. Is that right? She's a little petrified. Remember, this isn't to embarrass you. You see an intelligence report like that, and you're the chief of staff or the director of the CIA. What do you do? What do you do in DC when something like this happens?
I would probably talk to some experts to
You are
learn
the
more.
expert. You're the chief of staff at CIA. What do you think? What's going to happen next?
I'm not sure.
Okay. Actually, it's worse than what you think. You call a meeting. Whenever there's something really bad that comes in intel, you call a meeting, and there's going to be a meeting of the senior people in the White House Situation Room. So during the time I was there, I was probably there in the Situation Room more than 100 times for all kinds of things that were happening in the world. And here's what I want us to do. Pretend now, play the role of someone who is trying to brief President Trump on what he, the United States, should do in response to this intelligence assessment that you just saw. Okay, sir, right here, green sweater. What do you tell? What do you tell President Trump? Where do we start with this whole conversation?
Is it true? First, what is happening is real? Is it fake?
Okay, that's perfect. Again, this was not a plant. The first thing you do, actually, is you say, do the North Koreans actually have both the capability and the intent to conduct this attack, right? Just because intel says it's so does not necessarily mean it's the truth, right? There are intel facts and facts. So the first question you would ask is exactly that. Who here has some idea about North Korean cyber capability? Anyone here been dabbling in assessing the North Koreans? No? Okay. Well, what do you think? What's the first thing that pops to mind when you think about the North Koreans and a cyber attack?
Yeah, Sony.
Boom, good job. All right, also not a plant in the audience. You know, this is almost like traumatic to me to think back to this attack, right? Because I was in charge of cyber at DoD. I read in intel, North Korean cyber operatives have just attacked Sony Pictures Enterprises over a Seth Rogen film. And you think to yourself like, what, really? And so there we are, the day before Thanksgiving in the White House Situation Room. And the first question that the president asks is this actually a time when the United States should intervene to defend a private sector company, right? That's a legit question. Sony's corporate cybersecurity was very bad. There were a lot of things going on there that would make you think, you know, why should we defend a company that hasn't been taking care of its own cyber hygiene, for example? But when it came down to it, this was a really important case because it wasn't just about the hack of Sony, it was about the Constitution, and it was about the First Amendment, and it was about signaling to the North Koreans and the rest of the world that the U.S. wouldn't stand back, let someone like this get attacked, and determine what U.S. Americans were going to be able to watch or not watch, just because Kim Jong-un was unhappy about the way this came out. Keep in mind, though, this was also really important in terms of the North Koreans showing what you could do in a hack on the civilian sector. Remember, this is the first destructive cyber attack in U.S. history. They actually used a wiper virus to destroy a lot of the network there. But what did they do before that? These guys, they're very clever. Not sophisticated in the hack because it wasn't that hard. What are some of the things they did before that? We'll go this guy on the laptop, right? I warned you if you're on your laptop, you get picked on. Do you remember, like, what were some of the things they did with information in particular?
They took data and released it publicly and humiliated various contract parties.
Right. Y'all remember what this was? So there, the North Korean cyber operatives, they were in the network for months, taking all the stuff that would be most embarrassing. Payroll data, do you remember what came out? All the male actors paid way more than the female actresses. That was embarrassing. Racist jokes among senior Sony leadership. That was pretty good info ops stuff. So that, unfortunately, is not where the North Koreans stayed, right? They have gone on to become even more sophisticated. Kim Jong-un realized that cyber operations are a really important part of their national strength. They did other things, as you can see here, hacked into the SWIFT system, a theft of a Bangladeshi bank, stole secret plans from the United States military. Also, WannaCry, pretty significant in terms of the collateral damage. So remember, this was specialized ransomware created on a vulnerability, unfortunately, that leaked out of NSA, the papers tell me. And they then launched that into the wild in a money-making venture that cost FedEx, for example, $300 million. So you can see this is a pretty serious thing. When you talk about cyber capabilities then, it means the North Koreans are there. So the next thing we'll want to talk about then is intent. Okay, let's go to this gentleman right here. Tell me a little bit about North Korean intent. You see right now the context of the world. It looks like there's going to be a summit, maybe on June 12th. And some people are saying Kim Jong-un is getting ready to give up his nukes. What do you read into this? What's the intent from the North Korean side here?
I think survival of his government and world respect and power within the world.
So if you're briefing the president, do you trust the North Koreans? Should we be concerned that they actually would conduct a cyber attack against the U.S.? What's the scenario there in which this plays out?
No, I don't trust them based off of their past actions and basically just everything that they've done in the past to go against what they said they were going to do.
Yeah, personally, I really hope that there's a summit, the North Koreans give up their nukes, and peace breaks out across the Korean Peninsula. That would be a wonderful thing. I personally am super skeptical that any of those things will happen. Maybe there'll be a summit. And my fear is that after that, because tensions will start to escalate like they always have, that the North Koreans will turn to cyber as they have in the past and hit us where we're most vulnerable, which is in the democracy and the systems that underpin our democracy. So that's where you think about where they might go. Is there anyone here who just happens to be an expert on election systems, election infrastructure? No. So this has been an interesting thing for me. I have always been working in national security, in cyber. I was the CISO for a telecom. I did not know anything about state election IT infrastructure. But I was so concerned at the end of the administration, the Obama administration, that all the other bad guys around the world would see what the Russians did and tried to do, that they're going to emulate that and go after us where we're most vulnerable. So we're working on a little project that I could tell you about more about later. But the bottom line is these state election officials, they're really good people. They plan from a business continuity sense for really bad things to happen, right? They're used to the power going out. They're used to something not working, which is a good thing. But they are not equipped to be defending against the pointy tip of the spear of a nation-state intel service. And when you think about all the different vectors that a nation state like the Russians, it could easily be the Iranians. The Iranians also very capable as cyber actors. Think about what's going on with the Iran nuclear deal right now and why it would fit very easily into their logic to conduct an attack against a democracy too. Is you have to think about these points of vulnerability, right? All the social media platforms, I think now they have the message. Hopefully they're changing. I think I'm still a little skeptical about that. But if you look at the other places where a combination, a very potent combination of info ops, which means conducting false messaging, and cyber attacks could really undermine trust in American democracy. So imagine if you go back to the scenario that we planted with this intel report, is that you see that there's a threat against the midterm elections. This time it's turned around, that the North Koreans, unhappy because this summit has failed, have decided to go after Republican candidates to undermine their credibility with voters and as political leaders, and overall undermine trust and confidence in the democracy. This is something that really worries me. And I'm concerned that this is something that we're not doing enough about. So you see the vulnerabilities here are significant. And when you're thinking about risk, and you all know a lot about this, in the corporate sense, you think about threat, you think about vulnerabilities, and then you think about the next thing we'll talk about, which is how you mitigate those. And all of those things is what leads you to an eventual risk calculation. So let's talk a little bit about that part. If there's someone who is briefing the president and they're very concerned that we now saw that the North Koreans have very high-end cyber capability, that the intent is there, that we're vulnerable, then you come to the natural point where you think like, okay, let's do something about it. Is there anyone here who can explain this concept of the dime? What's the dime? Why are we talking about the dime in the context of generating options for the president on how to prevent a cyber attack against our democracy? Anyone? Okay, yes ma'am, here you go. If I tell you it's an acronym, just like everything in the military, what do you think the first one is? Where do you start when you're in the foreign policy making process? The first thing you try to do is you go to the State Department.
Discuss.
Discuss. Okay, you're basically right. It's diplomacy, right? So DIME, the very easy way to think about it is diplomacy, intelligence, military, and economic tools. That's the traditional framework you use for thinking through the options and what you're going to do. So when you go through that, you would say, well, we're going to talk to Kim Jong-un. There's this threat report. We'll see if with diplomatic initiatives we can prevent it from happening. That doesn't really work. Intel, pretty hard. Why? That would mean, for example, that we might, with the military or Cybercom or NSA, conduct a preemptive cyber attack. This is a picture of North Korea at night. What does that tell you about how difficult it is to craft these dime options that would prevent or maybe dissuade the North Koreans from attacking the United States or another democracy? This is a really hard problem. When you think about the normal options that you have. On the economic front, we've used almost every available lever we have to put economic pressure on them. From a military perspective, you have to be very careful about ratcheting up to make sure there's no escalation. The last thing you would want is the U.S. does something that results then in the North Koreans launching the 20,000 artillery tubes that they have on the north side of the border against Seoul. That's a disaster. This is a really hard situation. Even more important to recognize, though, is that DIME concept I just told you about doesn't have you all in there, right? Which is really an important thing to internalize. The government, as I just explained, has very limited options. And the government is not as adept at thinking about how the private sector can help. And I dare say, the tech sector is not used to thinking about defending a democracy and how they can help democracies around the world and how they can help from a national security perspective. Trust me, I understand how complex and fraught that is. After Snowden and everything else, I know that it's a complicated thing. But it is really important, y'all, that for democracies, and if the United States isn't something that you feel strongly about, it could be for the French, or it could be for the Swedes, or the Koreans, that you think about ways to help defend a digital democracy. So I have a couple suggestions. The first is that cybersecurity, when it comes down to it, it's a human thing. It's about leadership. That means if you're the CEO or you're someone who's in charge of an enterprise, a platform, any of the firms you all run, it needs to start at the top, and it's emphasized that we will have good cybersecurity, we will protect our users' data, and that's a priority. It was really interesting to hear Snap say from their core values that data security and information security is something that they've always prized. That's very encouraging to me. The second thing is, and I know this will be harder, sometimes I have the feeling that the tech sector doesn't think about the bigger picture and the rest of the world and even the country. And if you can do that every now and then, and you think about what you're doing, and that it's really important to the future of democracy, not just like Q2 earnings or what else is going on, we'll all be better off. And I know that's not a natural thing, but it really, I'm begging you all to at least think about that and try to help out in some way. So the reason that I have a picture here of this glass house is not because democracies are so fragile. I think it's actually more like a plexiglass house or a safety glass house, where you have to hit it really hard for it to break. And even when it does, you can mitigate the way that it shatters. So that's a lot like democracy. We're not so fragile. The U.S. is just not on the verge of falling apart. But if it keeps taking blows, it's going to undermine democracy, and that's not where we want to go. You see all the trends in the world right now are cutting against an open internet. When I first started 8 years ago in the Pentagon and read all the intel about what the Chinese were doing on the Great Firewall of China, I was like, there is no way they will ever pull out deep packet inspection in a country of 2 billion people, with a limited number of gateways. You know what? They did it. It's really impressive. They control most of their information environment. The Russians are working very hard to control state media, control their information environment. There are a lot of trends that are going exactly the way that the bad guys in the world would like it, and not the way a democracy should be. So thank you all very much. Sorry if I was lecturing a little bit in the Harvard way, but I really appreciate you giving me the time, and appreciate your attention too.